A serial killer moved next door and nobody believed me. I moved to a quiet town a few months ago, hoping for some peace after everything had gone sideways in my life. It was a small, sleepy place where people kept to themselves, and I thought it would be the perfect spot to reset. The house I rented was on the edge of town, old, a bit run down, but charming, the kind of place where you could breathe. At first, everything felt right. The neighbors were friendly enough, always greeting me when they saw me outside, but no one was really intrusive. It was peaceful. Then Thomas moved in next door. I didn't think much of him at first. He introduced himself as Thomas, quiet guy, early 30s, kept mostly to himself. He didn't seem like the kind to make waves, but after a while, I started feeling weird around him. He was always home, but never had guests. Every time I saw him, he was either coming or going, eyes down, never really looking at anyone. There was this odd vibe that made my skin crawl, but I couldn't pinpoint why. One day I noticed him standing outside in his yard, staring at the house. Not in a casual way, like he was studying it or maybe just lost in thought. When he noticed me looking, he quickly turned and went back inside. I felt this uncomfortable shiver. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. I think that's when it all started.
I tried to ignore it, but the weird stuff just kept happening. First, I noticed his house was always dark. No lights at all at night, even when I was sure he was home. That should have been fine, I guess, but it felt strange. Then every time I walked by his house, I'd get this weird smell, burning, but not exactly like fire. Something more chemical. It lingered in the air, making my stomach twist. Then came the garbage bags. They were always out by the curb late at night, huge, heavy bags, and the way he struggled with them made me think something wasn't right. I saw him drag them out at odd hours, and each time I couldn't help but stare. Something about the way he acted, glancing around, making sure no one was looking, felt off. I didn't know what to make of it, but it wasn't sitting well with me. So one night, I knocked on his door. Maybe I was overthinking things, so I figured I'd check in. He answered, and there was that same stiff smile. "I like it here," he said, like he was trying a little too hard. It didn't feel casual. I couldn't explain it, but there was something in his tone, the way his eyes didn't quite meet mine. When I left, I told myself it was nothing. But the weird feeling wouldn't go away. And that night, the scraping started again.
I didn't know what to make of it, but it wasn't sitting well with me. So one night I knocked on his door. Maybe I was overthinking things, so I figured I'd check in. He answered, and there was that same stiff smile. "I like it here," he said, like he was trying a little too hard. It didn't feel casual. I couldn't explain it, but there was something in his tone, the way his eyes didn't quite meet mine. When I left, I told myself it was nothing, but the weird feeling wouldn't go away. And that night, the scraping started again. I tried to push the thoughts out of my head, but I couldn't. I kept hearing the scraping. Metal on something, dragging slowly, going on for hours at a time. It was getting louder, more frequent. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Then one night, I couldn't sleep. I was tossing and turning when I noticed the light from his porch flick on. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I saw him. He was standing in his living room, facing the wall. At first, I couldn't tell what he was doing, but then I saw it, photos, pinned to the wall behind him. I couldn't see the details at first, but I could tell enough. The photos were of people, their faces twisted in terror, the kind of faces you only see when someone knows they're about to die. My heart sank. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. He wasn't just some quiet guy. He was something worse, and he'd been living next door to me this whole time. I wanted to call the cops, but I couldn't. I didn't have proof. Just a gut feeling and some awful pictures in my head. What could I tell them? No one would believe me.
I couldn't let it go. I told myself that I had to do something. So I called the sheriff. I explained everything. The bags, the weird smell, the photos, and how it all seemed to add up to something I couldn't ignore. I told him I was sure Thomas was involved in the disappearances around town. The sheriff didn't take me seriously. He said he'd look into it, but I could tell he didn't believe me. The next day, he came back empty-handed. No evidence, no bodies, no signs of anything unusual. I tried again, asked around, but no one else seemed to notice what I did. Everyone else was too used to Thomas being around, and they all just chalked it up to him being a quiet guy. I felt like I was losing my mind. I saw it, though. I knew what he was. Then one night, I saw him again, standing in his yard, staring at me. This time, though, he didn't look away. He didn't hide behind his blinds or act like he hadn't seen me. He smiled. It was cold, calculated, and I felt the shiver run through me. He knew. He knew that I knew. I couldn't stay there anymore. I was terrified, but more than that, I was frustrated. Everyone thought I was overreacting. The sheriff didn't believe me. I had nothing to prove it. I couldn't live like this anymore. So I packed up and left. I thought leaving would fix things, that maybe if I got far enough away, I could finally breathe. But as I drove out of town, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. I kept expecting to see him standing there, just watching me. And then, the thought hit me. What if he already knew I was leaving? What if he was just waiting for me to run? I kept driving, but I couldn't shake the feeling. What if he was already one step ahead? What if he knew exactly where I was going? The feeling of dread never escaped my body when a new neighbor moves in next door. I will never forget that stiff smile and that cold stare.